All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome. We're very grateful and glad that you're taking some time out of your busy day to join us. This is a continuing webinar series from MHA Consulting. We hope that it will provide you with some good information. Please, at any point, feel free to throw something into the chat, or just open up and ask a question. More than happy to keep this dialogue going. We try to do these on a regular basis to provide the business continuity community and the resiliency community with information that we're seeing that we think is important. So again, we're grateful. My name is Richard Long. I'm one of the senior advisory consultants here at MHA, and looking forward to speaking with you today about kind of an overall and interesting topic, one that we've done kind of continually throughout our practice, but really talking about the continuity culture. How do we bring people to understand the importance of that? One of the things, just if you don't know MHA very well, very quickly, we have been around for over 20 years, started by Michael Herrera, who has a tremendous background in continuity. I myself have been working here for over 15 years. My background is information technology, and spend a lot of time interfacing and working with non-IT departments to ensure that the IT and the non-IT functions are integrated and put together. So I help both on the IT side, but also the business continuity side. Probably split my time half and half, maybe even these days a little bit more on the business continuity side. But you can see we're an end-to-end company, and we really look to try to provide that value to organizations. We've got across multiple organizations, so as I said, I think that really helps us understand both the big picture, but also the specifics that organizations need. So you're going to be getting some of that. We go across all the verticals, and I'm currently working, I think, just about in every single vertical that we can think of. So this is just an idea of who we are. Obviously, that's on our website. Again, we go across the entire spectrum of business continuity and disaster recovery, all the way from assessments to continuing improvement and point solutions as necessary. If it's just a quick hit, we're happy to do that. If it's helping you develop and manage a program, we do that as well. So we really can go across. We can just jump right in, kind of parachute in and help, or we can start at the very beginning or wherever you may need it. So you can kind of see it's over both sides, both the technology side as well as the business continuity or the non-technology side. We also are continuing to expand our cloud-based tool set. We have the 5 here that you see. It starts with a current state assessment or compliance confidence that talks about where are you at in your program? How compliant are you against various standards? And then that helps you determine what are your next steps. We then have a BIA on demand that you can actually do a self-service business impact assessment independently, or if you hire us to do that, we use our tools ourselves. So this isn't just something that we send out to others. It started out as a tool that we used. We found it helpful, and now I'll provide that to our clients as necessary. So it's integral. I will be in that later today with some client work that I'll be doing. We can also develop your business continuity plans within a called Planner. And that can be not just business continuity plans, crisis management plans, disaster recovery plans, or anything. You can put templates in there, send those out, manage them, do whatever you like within there. BCM1 is kind of related to plan maintenance. That's just a data repository. It comes up in a kind of a Google Map display, and you can organize your plans based on the location. So if there's an issue at a location, you click on that, and then all your plans come up, and you can pull them up and leverage them as needed. Can be very helpful. And then lastly, a residual risk. That's really a kind of a data repository. It's really for more mature organizations and programs where you can look at, once you've done the basics, done all your initial mitigation, now looking at what else is out there that we should be potentially look at. What needs to be in and out of tolerance? What do we need to do to report? Really taking it to that next level. But really, before you do these other pieces, the residual risk probably isn't the tool for you until you've got a more mature solution. But all of those are there. We're all more than happy to talk to you about that as helpful. So, as I said, we're going to talk about culture today. And one of the things I think is important is that we kind of understand really what we're talking about. And I think there's some business leaders that kind of talk through that. Disney's one of my favorites. If you ever go, you kind of see that work at all of the properties. But I think the most important thing is designing, creating, and building, and doing all the things that we do is wonderful. But without people, the dream is not reality. People are really our most important asset, even though we talk a lot about technology. And even with generative AI, we'll talk a little bit about that. Culture is what people do when no one is looking or no one is checking. I think that's really appropriate for business continuity. Are people doing business continuity topics when you're not badgering them or going to them and saying, your plans need to be updated. Hey, we're going to do an exercise. Are they doing things on their own, or are they coming to you? And obviously, the culture is what's more important. It will outperform any strategy. It will make any plans better if you do that. And then kind of lastly for me that I really like, because I kind of goes back to ownership and culture, is if somebody owns it, quote unquote, nobody owns it, right? That whole idea of they will do it. Well, who is they? In an organization, we are they, right? So we have to own it no matter what it is, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Also, kind of from a big picture perspective, everything we do in business continuity is really about risk preparedness or risk mitigation. So you can kind of see it's all about the habits and time that organizations are oriented for. You can see what an organization's culture is as you meet with them, right? Some are financially oriented. Some are very safety oriented. Some may be just ad hoc response and reactive oriented. You can always see that. And so what we're trying to talk about here is how do we help organizations, or how does your organization start getting closer and closer to being a resilient culture? They're always looking at how do we make sure things are prepared as opposed to reacting or hoping. That maybe should be one of my other quotes. Hope is not a strategy. Which a lot of organizations have that. I sure hope that never happens. And if it does, we'll react. We're good at problem solving. That's not a good continuity kind of plan to be in. So you can kind of see there, your resilience culture is really what's going to help balance risk with all of your other processes and readiness. Ideally, you want to have that where your culture is mature, compliant, and people are looking at things from a readiness perspective. So as we think about culture, as we think about what's there, it's also important to make sure we understand some basic resiliency so that as you're working with teams, people can understand the differences between recovery versus resiliency, right? Recovery is all about reacting. It's all about being able to bring something up once there is an outage, right? Resiliency incorporates recovery, but it's all about the prevention, the risk management. Can we run the organization? Can I perform my functions in the most appropriate way? And the plans that I have in place, do they meet that requirement based on the business impact, the business need, customer expectations, etc.? And so often we kind of think of them as separate, and I like to do that because recovery, I think generally we should be thinking about it in terms of reactive. Resiliency is we are always going to be available and we'll be able to continue to function. But resiliency is very functional focused. Recovery can be very action focused. And from our perspective, from a culture, we want to think about it from resiliency as opposed to recovery. Resiliency is also going to be based on risk assessment and the appetite and tolerance. Do I need to prevent something? Do I need to just have something, have actions in place if it does occur? So kind of an important thing that as you're coordinating and working with teams, we'll refer back to. So when we think about resiliency, and again, looking at it from a cultural perspective, all of these different aspects are going to be part of what you need to be training and communicating from the technical side, ITDR, from an end user technology supporting business functions perspective, again, from a technology perspective. One of the things that I see there, especially kind of on the end user technology, is we've kind of gotten to a point where we all have laptops, so I don't have to worry about it. But then there's other dependencies that we need to consider. What about printing, right? We say we're an electronic organization until you dig into it and realize, oh, but I have these pieces of paper, especially in a logistics organization where they may still be dependent on bill of ladings or information that their logistics providers or their service provider needs from a third-party perspective. How do you get that if you're in some type of event and it's not the normal state of affairs? Understanding that balance between business continuity and crisis management. They're two different things, right? Crisis management's all about organizing, keeping people together, making sure that the strategic are being dealt with, and then the continuity is often thought of the actions that are keeping the functions going. Don't ever forget people and single points of failure. Single points of failure can always be equipment-based, it can be technology-based, but more often than not, those single points of failure are people. We say that we have backups, but all of a sudden you realize that one person that's highly critical always takes their laptop and is still getting called on vacation. Even though they might not technically be a single point of failure, I would call them a functional single point of failure. But also look at your equipment, especially if you're in something that's highly dependent on heavy-duty machinery or equipment types of things. Those often, because of the expense, there will be single points of failure, especially things like, in the shipping world or in the manufacturing world. There may be only one crane or overhead lift because you can't just have one sitting there and not being effective. So you need to look at that and then put in place, what are we going to do if? Are people actually considering that as opposed to just, I'll figure it out? One of the most important things that we will talk even more about here is exercise and training, exercise and training. All of the other work that we do from a documentation perspective, from a discussion about strategies, or even from a BIA and all that work that we do is important and it's great. But if people don't know what to do, it really doesn't matter that we have all of this data and we've got all these documents out there. In the end, it's about people. And lately I've been saying, if you have to pull out a document and you have to start at page 1 to know what to do, you're not prepared, you're not ready. You haven't trained, you haven't exercised enough. It would be like a firefighter having to pull out his SOPs and saying, when the alarm goes off, what do I do? Oh, I better get dressed. Oh, I've got to go to the truck. They know what to do. They've been trained. We need to do the same thing when it comes to our organization so that our documents are more training and reference documents. They're not what we consider to be, we're prepared, right? If people aren't prepared, they're not. We'll talk more about that. And then lastly, the two sides that are getting more attention, but from a culture perspective are really key is the supply chain and third parties. Organizations, when they're thinking about continuity and they're concerned about it and they've gotten in the culture, they're looking at those outside entities, those outside forces that they may or not be able to control, and are looking at how are they prepared, and if they are not, how are we handling our internal processes and our internal plans to take care of that if they aren't. So that all these pieces together really need to, our organizations and individuals need to understand where they fit and how they fit. Back to risk. When we think about risk, you've seen all of this before, but I just like to make sure we understand that there's 4 types of risk, from acceptance to avoidance to limiting to transference. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but as you're talking with folks and helping people understand, often we think that we've mitigated it, therefore I don't have to worry about it, where in most cases, we've either accepted the risk, we haven't done anything about it, it will happen, or we've limited the risk. We've said we're going to put in some strategies, but there's still some things that can happen. And then lastly, especially in the technology world, but also in the business functional world, we've transferred the risk. We've said, you're now responsible for that. SaaS solutions, cloud-based solutions, right? The vendors are responsible for keeping that application up. We don't. We just have to wait for them to do it. That's a transference type of situation. So as you're talking and you're working with folks, making sure they understand the distinction so that they can put the appropriate plans and they can be thinking about it from a day-to-day perspective is also very important. Now, when we think about culture, right, often we get right to, from a business continuity perspective, of the last bullet at the bottom, restoration of the business. When we think about culture, we really need to start with the people. If my people aren't safe, it doesn't matter. I can't restore the business, right? So we really start with, do people know what to do from an emergency preparedness perspective? Are they safe? Do they know what to do? That may not be your job. right? When we go back to ownership, that may be the safety and securities team, but as business continuity, it's related. So we want to make sure that we understand, are those things in place? Is that training happening? Do people know what to do? And do they see how that relates to continuity? Because if you can't get people out of the building, now you're worried about responding to that, as opposed to saying, we've stabilized the incident, we've now got everything in place, we've got our environment is stabilized, and our environment is safe and ready to go. Now we can restore the business because we've got people, we've got a location, we've got technology, we've got what we need. Now we can actually do the business continuity pieces. So all those linkages and that understanding is key. All right. So kind of as we kind of introduce that, now some of the practical pieces. We've kind of talked about, what does it mean to have a continuity culture? And I think this hits it perfectly, is when employees are asking themselves, right, when staff, not you, are asking themselves, how am I going to make sure that process, application, function, my people are going to remain available, even potentially not in the same state in case of some type of emergency event. And that's a constant conversation. That's the encouragement that you're going to want to be giving in different ways, right? And some of those things can be from a management perspective. It's kind of at the bottom there, is when you're working with your leadership team, encourage them to go out and ask questions of people. It's amazing when a senior leader of an organization, whether it's the C-level folks, or it might be the VPs or SVPs, or even the directors, depending on your size, as they're working and they're interacting with people, even in a meeting, quickly looking at the team to say, we've just had this issue. How are we going to respond to it? If people know that their management team is thinking about it, they're going to be conscious of it, because they don't want, one, they don't want to look bad if the question is asked, but two, they're going to realize that's important to the leadership. So first off is getting them bought in. And in order to do that in your regular business continuity steering committee meetings or updates that you're giving, make sure you're capitalizing on events to remind leadership of the issues that are out there and the need to be prepared for, and tie it back to your organization. Not just say, oh, that happened on the West Coast, or that happened on the East Coast, or that was a tornado in the Midwest in Tornado Alley. We don't have that. I live in Arizona, don't have that. But we can take that and use a different example. For us in Arizona, it might be a microburst, right? They could take something out, or other types of events, wildfires, whatever it may be. But take those events, see how it's impacted organizations, and tie it back to you so that it's real for your management team, that then will hopefully trigger them to continue going forward. The other thing is, make sure that you see those small successes, maybe when business continuity actions have provided value. It might have been it might not be an actual event, but somebody might have said, as you work with folks, hey, I used the concepts of my business continuity plan when this happened for a short outage. That's great things to continue to communicate. And now we're seeing people using it, and as also training and reminding. But again, if you have your leadership, it's amazing. I heard of a senior leader who would do that all the way down to the contract folks. He'd be walking around saying hi. This is his personality. And he would stop somebody and say, what's your role in disaster recovery? What's your role in business continuity? What would you do if we had to evacuate this building? What do you do? And it was everybody. He was talking with janitors. He was talking with individual contributors. And you could see that culture was going through. So real important piece, get management involved. I like to think of ongoing frequent communication, whether that's you going into team meetings or whether that's you encouraging and providing content for teams to have like a continuity minute. A lot of organizations have a safety minute, right? I work with one that no matter what the meeting is, it's a 30-second just reminding you about this safety thing. They're a safety culture. Same thing from continuity, 30 seconds. Hey, we're going to talk about something related to continuity. Could be documentation, where it exists. It could be just reminding folks of what their role is. Could just be asking them, what would you do if? But throwing that in on a regular basis, weekly if possible, will drive people to start thinking about it on a regular basis. And I talked about a little bit on ownership. As you're doing those continuity training and you're talking with people, making sure that the areas understand that they own their resilience, not you, not the BC team. You're the consultative firm. You don't own it. If they're looking at you and saying, and you ever hear the word, oh, the BC team handles that, that's a red flag. We're missing it. You need to go back and say, you own it. This isn't me doing it. This is all about you. I'm helping, right? Communicate what risks are out there, what also is being done to limit or mitigate those risks. And that needs to be on a regular basis. Too often our risks, we look at them the first time, we do a risk assessment, we say, yep, that's out there. We decide not to do anything about it, or it's really hard, or it's something that we've accepted the risk, but we then don't go back and think about it on an ongoing basis when, because of business changes, we may need to adjust our plans. And so that constant understanding and reminding about, hey, this risk does exist, so that people don't lose sight of that, just becomes the standard status quo. And we just know that is the case, and we kind of forget about it because it's just out there all the time. Look at how you understand your processes and impacts, again, from a continuity perspective. As you're doing BIAs, you're doing plans, people start making modifications to processes. Communicate that to the team so that they see, as you think about it, your processes may be improved. They may be enhanced, more efficient, because they're making them that way so that they're more resilient. You as a BC professional, participate in those team meetings as possible. Again, the more you can communicate, the more you're working with teams and helping them understand their role, will probably actually deliver more value than you just sitting down and harping on people to update their plans. That communication and letting them ask questions, that will take time as this culture changes. But the more you do that, the more you're out there, you will see that value. Again, we talked about capitalizing on events from an individual perspective, but I can't emphasize that enough. People need to see how important that is. Frequent updates on the information. Make sure that it's in people's minds. It goes back to that continuity minute, but that may only be quarterly. It may be multiple exercises. Include personal things, right? So that it isn't just about work, but include, what about your family? What about your individual preparedness? It could be all the way from, little health things to actual, home preparation, so that they see that link, that it isn't just about work. We're concerned about them as individuals because, again, if their personal and family isn't taken care of, that's going to be their focus. And so if there is an issue impacting them, they're not going to be available to work. And I've seen that firsthand, where when people's homes were under duress, or there were risks to their homes, people started dropping off conference calls because they had to take care of their home and their family. And then lastly, make sure you're integrating with security, information security, the cyber side, as well as the ITDR. That's really important that all of them are linked together because of the technology and the data impacts that we have. Okay. You're going to hear this, and you're probably going to be tired of it, but exercise, 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 exercise. Rather than the 4-hour tabletop exercise that we do on an annual basis, from a crisis management perspective, or maybe when we're updating plans and we get a few managers together to talk about it, we need to push these exercises and trainings all the way down to departments so that they know what to do. Again, it can be an hour, it could be 30 minutes on a quarterly basis, or encourage them to do 5 minutes in team meetings, just so people are thinking about it and so that they're actually doing things. And in those exercises, make sure that they're executing something and they're not just talking about it. It's amazing when you say, okay, I'm going to go find this piece of data in this report. Great, go do that. And they look at you funny, and then because they say, oh, that'll take 5 minutes. And when you have them do it, 30 minutes later, they're still trying to find the information, or they realize, oh, I don't have access to that. Or, oh, I actually have to go talk to this other department to get the data. So actually doing things in the exercises are going to really help. And you can see there, do multiple scenarios, not just the same one over and over of a system outage or that one critical system, right? Or we always do this one safety type of thing. Go across, somebody makes a mistake. There's a technology issue. Maybe it's a demonstration. It could be a weather issue. And include with that chaos testing, right? Really bring people together. When they see that value and they start looking at it and saying, this could actually happen, now you're going to start seeing people go off on their own and start doing things independently and proactively. But in today's world, that chaos testing that we call it really is multiple events and scenarios. And that multiple event could be the result of your first, right? It could be that there was some type of evacuation. And then in terms of that, somebody was injured, or somebody, because of the situation, people all ran out, or a fight broke out, or it was a weather issue and now people got sick a week down the road and you've lost people. So all of those type of scenarios that you need to think through could actually happen, as well as potentially multiple locations having a different situation at the same time, which we used to say, we only plan for one event in one location. Yeah, it won't happen elsewhere. We just know that that is no longer the case. Also, when you're thinking about your scenario, think about your hybrid workforce, which we're going to talk about here in a second, right? Is because in today's world, you've got some people in the office, some people at home. Maybe certain departments are fully remote, but some of their dependencies are on-site. You need to bring those two things together as well. And then lastly, we talked about integrating DR and BC from a planning perspective, but also do that from a testing perspective. Often we'll bring in a few people to test from an IT perspective, or vice versa, but really putting that together to say, we're doing our DR test, and once they failed it over, get a department in there, have them actually do it, and run that way and see what happens when multiple people are doing it, not just the most experienced and those who are used to it. Okay, so just some cultural issues that I'd like to kind of work through as it relates to continuity, because the way people work and what they're doing is really key to tying this into all this information that you're going to share. One of the things that we're seeing from a hybrid perspective is people are finding they don't want to go to work, not because it's convenient, that's one reason, but also they really don't want the interaction. And so team building now is really changing. And how do you get information out to people, right? Especially as they're working remote. Because if they're on site, they still may be a situation where part of a team is on site, part of a team is remote. And so you're not necessarily always going to have people in the office in the same physical location at the same time, either by design or by choice. And so we've got to look at that. The other thing that you need to think about from a business continuity perspective that we're seeing, especially in organizations where, in kind of more the manufacturing or logistics or those type of site, or maybe where there's a high customer touch process or function where people have never been remote. There is a resentment for those who have said, I've been working on site, I've put myself at risk for the last 3 years, while all these other folks have been able to work remote and they moved and they did all of that. That resentment is real. And so working on now how people will interact during an event just became more difficult, and understanding that difficulty, again, may not be your role to necessarily fix, but you can be asking questions with HR or with the culture team, however that is describing your organization. Hey, do we have this? It's something I need to be concerned about. Do we need to be asking managers these questions so that we can put appropriate plans in place to ensure that we understand all of those things? It's a sensitive topic, and I understand, but it really is key. And then just from an efficiency perspective, right? We're starting to see, remote workers, participating in more and more meetings, but there's no hallway conversations. We don't have that interaction, so I can have that quick conversation of, hey, I was thinking about this, Mary. What do you think? I actually have to set up a meeting for that. So our efficiency is not quite what it used to be because we don't just drop by. Distractions. Still, we have the care issues of people who are either working at home because they're concerned about that, they've lost that capability, or they just have that in their day-to-day capabilities. We still hear that on meetings, right? Kids are in the background, whatever it may be. Work ethic questions come up. Again, that goes back to continuity. If we're seeing issues with work ethic, how is that going to impact when a real event happens? If they don't care day to day, people really care when an emergency happens. We assume they do, but that may not be the case, and you really want to look at how do we bring that up. Again, may not be your issue, but something to consider as you're pulling this culture together. And then lastly, generative AI. I heard a very interesting podcast from Harvard Business School that was talking about that when we're thinking about our culture, the use of generative AI is becoming part of our culture because it's actually becoming a de facto employee or a de facto process that's answering, especially if you're using that from a customer interaction perspective and using those chatbots, or people are going in and using generative AI for their work. and how that interacts and how people are looking at that and interfacing with that. Is it as um, cordial and friendly, or that you would do face to face, or as we've seen, especially in our social media world, how does that work where we're very blunt or we can be very critical? So take into account the generative AI side, because that is becoming almost an employee in some cases to a certain extent, or at least a high use. Technology. From a cultural perspective, as you're sharing those cultural minutes and you're doing that, one of the things to make sure you're looking at is manual workarounds. Help people understand those manual workarounds really are important. They need to think about those on a regular basis. Too often we're like, if the systems go down, there's nothing I can do. And I always ask the question, so you're telling me if that system goes down, you stop working and you do nothing, you just sit there and wait till they come up. 90% of the time, people will say, well, no, I'm going to go figure out X. I'm like, well, great, let's go figure out X now, right? What are you going to do? How are you going to do that? Let's at least get the template in place, right? Again, thinking through those things. I know that's kind of development, but it is part of the culture so that people start thinking about, I can't just say I can't do. That's too easy a statement. It's getting them constantly thinking, right? Data protection. How are people actually working? Again, this is kind of that interaction with cybersecurity and all of those pieces as well. The remote office resiliency. Does the remote staff, has the IT team, have all of those folks looked at the resiliency at their location, at their home or their remote office? Too often we just rely on the internet, right? We're not necessarily providing a ton of equipment, or maybe we are, but we're dependent on the way they care for it. So who's going to pay for some of that if it's there? What happens if that goes down? Are your local folks thinking about the safety of their home? Hence that conversation I mentioned before about make sure you're thinking about their personal safety and their home office continuity efforts as well. Also, the office space for a hybrid, we're seeing more and more that people don't have a dedicated space. It's hoteling. So people come in, they're sharing space. So it's for those that need that, that's a very uncomfortable place to be. Or when they come in, today they're working on floor 3, tomorrow they're working on the 2nd floor, or they may be working on the opposite side of the floor because somebody's already got that desk. Again, how you use that is different from when we used to say, well, we're just going to get up and we're going to move remote, or we're going to bring people in because they have to. Well, do your offices even have the space anymore if all of your teams or all of the staff need to come in that are in a certain city because we've actually made it hoteling and we know we don't need all that space? Again, that's, when we think about those cultural challenges, that maybe isn't so much of making people culturally reliant, but it helps because are they thinking about it? If you're walking around and all of a sudden you see just this hoteling space, is anybody asking the question, what would happen if? And that's really what we're trying to get to. Hence that training, those conversations, and bringing up multiple conversations. And then cyber kind of considerations. Make sure people are thinking about their personal devices, the transferring of data from home to office or vice versa. Hard copy usage. People are now, I've seen even more people, even though they say, we've got OneDrive, we've got Google, we've got whatever it is, but people are still saying it's convenient to print that out because I've got to look at it if I'm doing X, Y, and Z, or I can't get to my information, especially the use of personal versus corporate email accounts, because I'm going to be somewhere and it's easier for me to look at my personal phone because that's the one that's always with me versus the other. Just again, those ideas of looking at things from an overall cultural perspective and a resiliency perspective, as opposed to just a ease of use, and tying that together. So what's the benefit as you go through and are having these conversations and really focusing on more training and conversations and helping people do that, right? One is you're going to see teams are taking the initiative and they're going to come to you and asking questions. We're actually seeing that in a couple of our clients where several divisions of the organizations, after we've done a couple of exercises, are seeing it. It's clicked, and they're coming in and now saying, hey, we're worried about this. Can we have help with this? Or we're going to go off and do this. Do you have any advice? We're updating our plans, or we'd like to do another exercise. Can you give me a scenario, right? Then people are starting to think through that, right? making sure that the necessary document is actually relevant and they're reading it. You probably think about this when on your annual review and you go back and look at documents and the date's been updated and the tracking's in there, document reviewed and updated, but you actually look at the plan and you're like, no changes. Maybe there was a couple of people because staff has changed. But from a content perspective, it's the same way it's been for the last 3 to 5 years. When people are actually looking at that and driving it and saying, this is wrong, now you're starting to have that benefit because they're concerned and it's actually relevant. It's not just an annual activity to get the business continuity team to stop bothering them with emails to get things updated. Or they're coming back and saying, I need a document that looks like this. I've got this spreadsheet that I actually want to use. And great, now it might be referenced in your other documentation, but they're actually using something. We've talked about a little bit on processes may become more efficient because as they think about the resiliency, they need to modify how they're doing things. Maybe that will get rid of paper because they realize that paper won't be there. I need to have this already scanned, or I need to have this in the system. That's where I'm going to rely on. I'm not going to rely on my old process, which was less efficient. Better training and staff to ensure really cross-training. The more we talk through this and we start having exercises and we take out the primary person and say, okay, you're the secondary, what are you going to do? And they're like, I have no idea. Well, did you look at the plan? Never looked at it. And they open it up and they go, this makes no sense to me. Now we're starting to get people, actually, they have to talk. They have to figure out what's going to happen. And now that just helps the organization as a whole because there are more people to do the work. They can spread things out. We're not reliant on just a few people to do some critical functions. As we've kind of talked throughout this whole thing, BC teams become more consultative. Now you're able to enhance just keeping things status quo. How great would it be if you're really seeing the organization become more prepared as opposed to, yep, we're going through, going to spend the next 3 months just updating and talking to people about updating their plans, right? Actually doing things that are going to be functional from an exercise perspective, mitigating risk, helping those teams improve what they're doing. That's when business continuity and resiliency really becomes fun, right? And then you're going to see true resilience and preparedness, right? Not limited to just the bare minimum to meet our regulatory needs. One of the things that I hear sometimes is people will say, I don't know why we're talking about this. I passed my last audit. And I say, audit doesn't mean prepared. So that right there, we know that it's just a task. It's an audit task. It's not a cultural task. So it goes back into that training and learning and helping people understand that we're going beyond just what's required. If you meet what we're trying to encourage you to do from a continuity perspective, the audit's of no question. You don't even have to prepare for an audit. You're already there. You might quickly go through it. But when you're just looking at meeting regulations or policy or audits, that's when you spend the 3 months before the audit preparing and fixing. Man, if you're prepared, you don't even have to worry about it. Auditor comes in, you're like, here's everything I have. Let me know if you have any suggestions. We're very confident and we're very sure that we're in a good place. So where do you really need to kind of focus to start getting you to this continuity culture, right? It's all the same things that we do on and on and on, but the priorities are slightly different. It's really making sure you understand your risks and needs so that and your single points of failures and gaps, right? And prioritize those. Then when you go in and start having these communication and these training, it's going to resonate much better as opposed to just, it's the same old thing. Oh, we're talking about a weather issue again. Well, we know we're prepared for that, right? We're hitting them now where there's pain, where they actually get a little uncomfortable. Now people will start reacting. That's where we see the benefit and we start seeing that culture change. When people are uncomfortable, they want to get to a level of comfort and then they'll start making changes. So have a good understanding of what risks are out there at a departmental level, not just at a corporate level. Is it a people problem? Is it a process? This one technology is always going down. I worked with a client recently where one of their statements was, we have an outage of our phones and we have a problem 1 or 2 times a week. It's not long, right? It might be 5 minutes, but we're back on our cell phones doing things. It's like, okay, now we start using that as an example of what do we do if it's longer or what's happening from a actual day-to-day resiliency perspective. That resonates. And then lastly, really work with senior leadership on those things that I mentioned before. True event, how it relates to your team, the benefits that are being seen. so that they can actually look at it practically and from their perspective. It can't just be a bunch of detail. You've got to look at it from, this is how it's going to impact us as an organization. We're at risk here. And if that happens, this is what's going to happen. This is how we will not be able to service our customer. This is how we may be delayed in delivering our products or services. Or we're going to have to cut this customer out because this one's more important, and what's that going to do to us reputationally? Putting all of those things together will help senior leadership help drive that and start asking those questions and supporting you in what you do. That was relatively quick, but I wanted to kind of keep this one tight because it's really more about what do you do and culture and everything else. You are always welcome. You've got my contact information there. Please, at any time, shoot me a note, ask me a question. We're always willing. I'm always willing to spend a few minutes with you on the phone, communicating back and forth through email, whatever the question may be, across any aspect of continuity, disaster recovery, preparedness, crisis management, whatever it may be. If you just have, hey, I've got a quick question. Hey, could you give me some advice on this? Happy to do that real quickly. Obviously, we're not going to, spend an hour or two, but a quick opinion or assistance is always welcome, and we're happy to do that to help you move your program along. So if there aren't any other questions, we'll let you go. Obviously, you'll get a link to this information, the webinar recording. But I really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully there was at least one thing that triggered something in your mind that you can go off and do today or this week to try to help move your culture along. But if there's one thing I could say is more training, more communication, help people understand how it impacts them. Have a great rest of the day.